Welcome to another episode of Untethering Shame, where we delve into the depths of understanding what shame is and how it affects us in our daily lives. Today, I'm honored to be joined by Simon Rinne, a dedicated social worker and the founder of Mindful Men, a therapy practice focused on supporting men with mental illness and disability. Simon's journey with mental health is deeply personal, having lived with obsessive compulsive disorder, depression, anxiety, and burnout for over 3 decades. In our conversation, Simon bravely shares his own struggles with silence and societal expectations around masculinity, highlighting the pervasive stigma that often surrounds men's mental health and addiction. In today's society, there exists a profound need to dismantle the barriers that prevent men from seeking help and support for their mental health and addiction challenges. By opening up the dialogue and amplifying voices like Simon's, we aim to challenge outdated notions of masculinity, promote vulnerability as strength, and ultimately foster a culture of acceptance and healing for all individuals. Join us as we explore the intersections of shame, resilience, and transformation in men's mental health and addiction recovery. Welcome, Simon. I'm so excited that you're here.
Kira, thanks so much for that introduction. It was absolutely spot on and amazing, and really excited to be here.
Yeah, me too. I've been thinking a lot since we first chatted about all of the things I want to try to cover, and then also being very bluntly reminded by the other half of my brain that we can't cover all of them in 45 minutes. So we'll just say this is an introduction, and then it's a great segue for people to come and listen to your podcast and follow you and go deeper, because this is your niche. This is what you focus on. So I like to start every episode just doing a grounding exercise. And therapist to therapist, you can totally appreciate that. I'm curious if you could describe how you're feeling right now with one word. What would that word be?
Anxiety is the word that's dominating my life at the moment. So anxious. So
yeah. Would you say that that's just sort of been a pervasive presence as of late, or it's something that kind of showed up just as you were coming into this call?
No, it's been sticking around. So we were talking off air that we recently sold our house and we're living in a temporary accommodation space. We're in a resort, which is great for the family and the little kids. We're having fun, but we miss our space, and so we're on the house hunt at the moment. So just trying to find houses or a house and move into that is causing our family a lot of anxiety at the moment. So that's dominating my brainwaves at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's also this idea of rooting, and so from one anxious brain to another, we need some predictability and security. And so it sounds like by choice made this decision, but that doesn't mean that your anxious brain is like, well, you're going to be fine. We'll find a house soon. Let's enjoy the moment. Your anxious brain is like, what the fuck? Where is my root? I don't have it anymore. And I am not going to stop talking at you until you give me some sense of rooting. And so it's very challenging to navigate that, because logically it's not like you're fine, you're safe, things will work out, but that part of your brain really doesn't care about that logic.
Absolutely. And we'll talk about this today, but historically, alcohol would have been my safety blanket, and I would have just obliterated that anxiety with alcohol. But since I've been sober, I was talking to my GP yesterday. We're having a medication review, actually, and I said, usually I would suppress all this anxiety that I'm feeling with drinking. And so now I've got to try and come up with new ways. And so we've got a bit of a plan and some strategies in place. But it doesn't take that anxiety away instantly like alcohol used to. So
right. And being able to, and I'm sure that is such a big step for you to even see that now. And, we'll break it down and kind of go from where you started to getting to this point. But that is that piece of doing the work, is you've done the insight building, you can recognize these things. And I think this is where a lot of people that maybe haven't gone to therapy or haven't gotten to this place yet, or maybe have wishful thinking still of, well, I just can fix it and I can solve it. And if I do enough, I won't feel these things anymore. But the reality is you're going to feel that tension for the rest of your life, and it will get easier you didn't grab alcohol this time. There was a time you would have grabbed it without thinking, but it doesn't mean you're not going to think about it or that you're not going to want to escape those thoughts. And that is still you in recovery and living a very full and recovered life. It just means sometimes being human really sucks, especially when we're not trying to distract away from it.
It did, and you nailed it. Like, I do think about it sometimes, and I don't want it, but I do think more recently, like, it would just be easier if I just have a drink.
Yeah.
Or even yesterday, I was talking to the doctor about medicinal cannabis, and this is only something that's recently become available in Australia. Like I said, do I take that? And I think I'm looking for an escape at the moment. But he said, no, we're okay. It's okay. Let's look at your current medications because they do work. Wide chain, something that does work, and the coping strategies around that. But knowing that this isn't forever, this is going to come to an end when we do find a house and we do move into something. So just hold in there. So I'm holding in there at the moment. It's challenging, but I'm committed to the cause. I don't want to go back to the drink because it was 20, 25 years relying on that as a coping strategy. So I'm looking forward to not relying on that anymore.
Yeah. Well, let's walk us through that because you talk about, and I know you very openly share that you've struggled with mental health for a very long time and a variety of different diagnoses that I'm assuming you got over the years. And as you were able to start speaking up and kind of talking about what was going on, how old were you when you remember first starting to feel that distress, even if you couldn't name it?
Yeah, so I grew up in the 80s and 90s and noughties, and I like to say that because as a social worker, context is really important. And as a therapist, we always go into, tell me about your childhood and trying to understand, excuse me, what it was like to grow up in the area that you grew up, what were the influences and so forth. And so leading up until 8 years old, Mum would say, Simon, you're a really happy-go-lucky kid. You're someone who's always smiling, laughing, nothing phases you. You have no weight on your shoulders, and I loved that about me, and I thought that was a very good compliment, even though I didn't know what a compliment was at 8 years old. But then something changed, and I was in a schoolyard, and another student said to me, Simon, if you stop using your voice for more than a minute, you're going to lose your voice forever. And something in my brain held on to that. And I think it was because I loved being this happy-go-lucky kid. And to be a happy-go-lucky kid is to have a voice, to be able to laugh, to be able to tell jokes, and to be able to have a bit of banter. And I didn't want to lose my voice forever. And so this scared the hell out of me. And so this was essentially my introduction to obsessive compulsive disorder. So this created an obsessive thought of fear of losing my voice and losing my identity because that's part of my voice. And so to alleviate that distress, I couldn't just let it go. I kept thinking and thinking about it. So to alleviate that distress, which forms the C in OCD, so the compulsive behavior that I have to perform to alleviate the anxiety, was I hummed to myself every other minute. I would go, just checking that my voice was still working. And I would do it so quietly that nobody would take notice, and nobody ever said anything. I did this for about a year and a half to 2 years. I did this humming thing. And so this was my introduction to OCD. I didn't know it was OCD at the time. In fact, I didn't know it was OCD until I was 28 when I was diagnosed. And that diagnosis also came with depression and generalized anxiety as well. But for 20 years, I did these little quirky things, and it certainly OCD evolved into something really dark into my teens. But I was struggling with depression, anxiety. I didn't have a way to name what was going on. So coming back to growing up in the 80s, 90s and noughties, nobody talked about mental health. At least nobody did where I lived in this little pocket of Australia. It wasn't part of our vocabulary. It wasn't something that people would say, oh, how are you going? Are you okay? And be referring to, how's your mental health going? It was the opposite. It was actually, to be a boy and to be a man was to be someone who sucked everything up, who didn't talk about emotions, who buried it with alcohol. So that was part of the culture as well, was to be someone who wouldn't cry or show emotions or show any sign of weakness. And this was influenced by my family. So I have 3 brothers and a dad, and we had a very masculine household. We all played sport, and we all played Australian rules football. So it was very masculine sport as well. We all watched, hyper masculine TV shows. So my older brothers would dictate what was on the TV, and that would be things like Die Hard and The Terminator, Rambo, like really hyper masculine alpha male personality TV shows or movies. And then, be reinforced on the sports field, on the footy field. So if you got hit, and I was a bit of a sensitive kid as well. So if I got knocked down, I might shed a tear, but I'd quickly wipe that tear away because I didn't want to be the target of the next big hit, because that's what would happen if you showed any sign of weakness on a football field.
Oh, they targeted you.
The next target. Yeah, like a bully does in school. Yeah. And so this was reinforced in the schoolyard, and to show any sign of weakness, you'd become the target of bullies and so forth. And so I didn't want any of this targeting. I wanted to be seen as strong and with it and together. And so I put the mask on of mental health really well. I was still like that alpha male. I was kind of like the jock. I always played every sport at school. I was good at every sport. I was very athletic, and everyone idolized me a little bit for that kind of thing as well. And so I kept that bravado going, but internally I was an absolute shell of a person. And I was a shell for 3 decades, because even though I was diagnosed at 28, I still held onto that mask really tight until my late 30s, when I burnt out in 2020 and took off that mask because I could no longer wear that mask. It was suffocating. Yeah. And then, a lot of people in the world at 2020 were wearing masks, and we're talking about COVID here. But I don't know, something about that burnout situation when I had to take 4 or 5 months off of work. I was stuck on the couch. I couldn't do anything. I was spent physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually. I couldn't perform my role as a dad very well or a husband very well, and something needed to change. And a lot of that was me taking off the mask and showing my true, authentic self, and getting vulnerable and allowing that to happen. And yeah, so much has happened in between that 8-year-old up to a now 40-year-old. But yeah, that 8 years old is when it all started in the schoolyard, and started a lifelong obsession with obsessive compulsive disorder, I guess you could say that.
Well, it's interesting because it's, many of us, we're not saying that one interaction was the domino that made everything happen. We're saying it was some sort of a trigger, an amplifier, an access door that opened, that allowed what was probably already happening in your brain to start really consuming you and to take over. And every one of us, I go back to the moment that I ran in. I have no idea how old I was. It would have been kindergarten, I think, or maybe first grade. I think it was kindergarten, because it was before they use A's as a grade, although I don't even know if they use them then either. But I ran in the door. I had gotten my report card from my teacher. She was so proud of me, and she told me that when she handed it to me, but I didn't know how to read all the words on my report card. I didn't know everything it said. I ran in, I blew open the bathroom door because I was so excited to show my mom. She's in the middle of peeing, and I'm like, here, take this, look at this. And she immediately starts frowning as soon as she looks at it, and looks at me and is like, I don't remember her exact words, but something to the effect of being disappointed in me. And I was like, what? I was just shattered. What happened? I thought this was something that was so exciting, such a testament to my success. Well, what ended up happening is she read the legend incorrectly. So she saw C's all over the report card, interpreted that to mean average. I had performed average. But apparently C in the legend meant commendable. So I was performing really well. And she didn't read that before she looked at it. And her snap reaction basically told me, oh, it's not okay to be average. And that right there was, again, it opened the door for my anxious brain to be like, hell yeah, I'm coming in, I'm taking over. And so it's so interesting how those moments happen. And it sounds like for you, it was, you had this role, this sense of self that felt really good to you. And that interaction basically introduced the idea you could lose it. So then it was something that wasn't you. It wasn't inherent in who you were. It was something you could lose. So then it became something you had to keep. And then it anchored everything sort of external to you. So then everything that you did was about that sort of external performance. I don't want any of that to happen. If I lose that, what will people think? I can't control these things. And so your brain is just like, I need to figure out how to get some semblance of control. I need to be okay. Mixed with that, when you said, I forget exactly how you phrased it, like toxic masculinity, essentially in these shows, I was like, oh, so just basically movies in the 90s and the 2000s, because I feel like that's all we saw and still continue to see, just maybe at a slightly less percentage. But all the messaging you got was, one, mental health. We don't talk about it. No, but everybody's fine. Everybody's okay. Your problems are inconvenient. You need to be okay. And my guess is you had 3 siblings. So there's also this dynamic that happens with multiple siblings of like, mom and dad are already overwhelmed. I've got to kind of be the one that's the peaceful, the playful, the fun one. Again, going back to your role and what your mom celebrated you for. But then now as that starts to happen and you go, okay, trying to figure out who I am as a person. I'm trying to figure out how I fit into this family. I'm trying to figure out how I don't lose my place in school. Oh, and I'm a man. So I guess I've got to figure out how to do these things. And the stories and the rule books just keep piling up. And it sounds like I'm sure you didn't hold it together as well as you thought you did. But it's that, one, you were trying to hold it together and you did it well enough that when the rest of the world around you is conditioned not to look for those things, that comes together as a perfect storm for no one to see it and no one to dissect it.
Yeah, you touched on something there, perfectionism, really well. And I'm glad you did, because similar to your story, and I don't really talk about this very often, is my parents and particularly my dad. Like if we played football and if we messed around at training or we messed around in a game, like kids do sometimes, they're not focusing on the sport, they're actually focusing on what their mate's doing next to them or whatever. Yeah. Or if I played a bad game or I trained badly, like my dad would rip into me and he would tell me that it's not good enough. I need to be better than that. And so I had this drive to always be perfect in myself and do the best training I could do, always at 100%, never anything less. And that was also translated into school in my grades as well, which is interesting that you said that, because like I came from a lower socioeconomic background. Like mum was a cleaner, dad worked at the council, and then on the evenings he would go and clean. We had a family cleaning business that wasn't doing very well at all. In fact, it was going south very quickly. None of my siblings went to university or college, depending on where you are in the world. We didn't have great grades. My brother worked at a bakery. My oldest brother worked at a bakery. My other oldest brother, he went into the military. So like, we're not talking like people that are lawyers, dentists, doctors, rocket scientists and so forth. And this was actually quite normal for a lot of the families that we knew as well, and my friends and stuff like that. In fact, a lot of those households were single parent households or people who were unemployed. There was a lot of addiction and crime in the areas that I grew up with. And so this notion of trying to be perfect on the football field, but then also in school as well. If I came home with anything other than a B, if it was a C, D or worse, I would get ripped into, and even at a B level, I'd get questioned as well. Like, why couldn't you get the A? And so for someone with obsessive compulsive disorder, that perfectionism is very important because everything has to be just right. And so when I hummed, for example, I had to hum in a certain tone. And if that tone wasn't quite right, if I maybe had a croaky throat, and something happened when I tried to hum, I would have to do it again and again and again. And then I had all these other behaviors that I developed over time. So, for example, in my teens, I would go around and spend 3-4 hours locking up the house every night because of this overwhelming fear that someone's going to break in, steal our stuff, murder us, kidnap us, whatever it is, really bad stuff. And I would spend 3 to 4 hours checking and checking and checking to make sure that house was perfectly locked, that nobody could get in and nobody could cause any harm. And to add a bit of context to that, when I was doing that, my mum and dad separated as well. So now we were that single parent household. And me and my little brother went with mum. And so we had to start over, and I essentially became the man of the house, and I put that label on myself. Nobody asked me to be the man of the house, but I felt this need because that was also a thing back then as well. There was always some sort of man of the house. And so always striving for perfectionism and to be perfect in myself, but also expecting other people to be pretty perfect too. And if there was any sign of imperfection, that would really create my anxiety and OCD to really skyrocket and go really crazy. And again, alcohol, when I found alcohol when I was about 15, 16, that helped to bring down that levels of huge anxiety, but also allowed me to not be perfect and just to be me and to feel normal. And in fact, burnout happened because I could no longer reach that bar of perfectionism in my professional career. I was doing everything perfect. I was trying to be that perfect employee, but things just got so out of hand that I could no longer jump up, touch that lofty bar of perfectionism, and my world crumbled down. And in fact, since then, I've really started to embrace imperfectionism. And in fact, I've got a practice framework as a social worker called wabi, sabi. So it's the beauty in imperfection. And so I'm really trying to embrace that things don't need to be perfect for me to be able to survive and in fact thrive and to be well. And it's about sitting in that discomfort and allowing that to come in. But for so many years, I tried to bat that discomfort away, and I obliterated it with alcohol and distraction and all these other things that a lot of guys do. And I'm finding out now as a therapist for men that a lot of guys were in a similar boat. They were trying to find an escape from whatever was tormenting them in their heads. And perfectionism, it's so intertwined with OCD. We have to do things, as I said, so that they're just right. Otherwise, chaos reigns in the brain, and it becomes like a never-ending mental prison. I've heard of this term mental prison recently, and I think it's really applicable to someone with an anxiety condition, for example, because you can escape other kind of conditions, but an anxiety condition where it's stuck in the brain, it ruminates and goes over and over and over again. It just feels like there's never any release. And I think that's probably where I'm at the moment with that anxiety. I feel like there is never ending release with finding this house. But I know when I put the rational brain on and I get rid of the emotional brain, which I often think in the emotional space, that, we will find a house and anxiety will come down. And I won't need to go, as I said before, to alcohol.
Well, I think what's interesting, two things about what you said are sitting with me. So one, I experienced, let's just say, OCD adjacent tendencies. I struggled with an eating disorder for a very long time. And the way that specific disorder works is very much like OCD. There's some sort of an obsessive thought. There is some sort of compulsive behavior that I need to do. And then there's this feedback loop that basically comes into play. And perfectionism and the idea of perfectionism plays into OCD so well because it's basically gives you this idea of, well, here's the marker. If you do this, the anxiety will go away. If you do this, X will be solved. But the marker keeps moving, but you don't see it in the moment. It's the same as I'll have a client come in and we'll talk about things, and maybe they'll have a goal weight or they'll have a certain, thing, whatever that is, that if they get to this, it will be fine. And I say, when you get to this, it will move. And it's this idea of realizing the target is not fixed because perfection is an illusion. And it's an illusion that our anxiety brains, is specifically if it's manifesting as OCD or if it's manifesting in a different way, it wants you to buy into that. So you stay drinking the Kool-Aid. And then when it gets too much, it's like, well, here's alcohol, or here's this will help a little. This will calm you down. This will level you out so that you can get back on track and you can do it even better. And so that kind of stuck with me. And I'm thinking kind of probably how that started to come in for you. But the second piece I started thinking about too is this idea of, I don't know who was talking about it. It was on a podcast I listened to recently, but they were talking about with kids, particularly, so my daughter's 4, and thinking about how we talk to kids about emotional intelligence. If they get scared, let's say that they're scared about a monster under the bed, the typical response from a caregiver is to focus on whatever the thing they're anxious or scared about is. There's no monsters under your bed. Let's look at that. Instead of recognizing that once you've solved that problem, their fear is going to jump to something else, because really what it is their brain experiencing this emotion and needing to go through the process of experiencing it. So even for us, like when you said, once you have a house, your anxiety will go away, it won't. It's just going to find a new target. But the thing that you and I never got to learn, and particularly, and this is where I think that masculinity piece comes into play for you and the layer of addiction, is you had even less of an opportunity and grace with it, was to understand what to do when that is present without having to fix it. You don't have to fix it. And the OCD was the fix. The drinking was the fix to then go back to the opposite fix. The idea of distress tolerance is different from basically distress absolution. So I'm curious for you, and when I'm saying that, what's coming up? And then how did alcohol come in as kind of a means in that story to basically work in favor of your anxiety at the end of it all?
Yeah, it's funny you said the monsters under the bed, because one of the OCD things I did, I watched Gremlins way back when.
Yeah.
and if my drawer in my bedroom was slightly open, like where I had my socks and all that type of stuff, like I would freak out because I thought monsters would come out of that thing. But as I said, I'd never had the opportunity to try and work through those emotions. It was just something in my brain that I was trying to figure out myself, trying to fix myself.
Mm-hmm.
And so I did a lot of that with all the other anxiety behaviors and so forth. And before I get to alcohol, I'll go to the healthy alternative, which I've learned. And you know, after burnout, what happened was I created Mindful Men as a bit of a platform to share my story. And one part of that was creating an Instagram account. And through that, it starts telling me the type of people that I might want to follow. And for the first time ever, I found all these people that were talking about OCD. And I never knew, even though I was diagnosed in 2012, I didn't know a single other person that had lived with OCD. It wasn't talked about in media. Like, it was depression, anxiety by that stage. Burnout was, I think, something around COVID as well, but not OCD. But then finding all this community of people with OCD, I'm like, oh wow! For the first time, I don't feel alone in the world. So there's other people out there that get me. But they're all talking about this thing called exposure response prevention, or ERP, as a gold standard for OCD and for treatment for OCD. And I'm like, oh, I've never even heard of this, even though I was diagnosed and I've been to countless therapists over the years. Not one therapist wanted to target the OCD. It was always the depression, the anxiety, and the drinking. And so when I started seeing this thing of ERP, I'm like, you know what? I've never targeted this, and I think it's time maybe now to focus on the OCD treatment. And so I did find a local provider. There's not many in Australia that do ERP. And it's actually prompting me to do some training and become an ERP therapist myself. So that will come down the track. But yeah, I went into this session, and a lot of it was around understanding what OCD is in the first place. And I didn't realize there was all these different things called themes, like, you know, there's different types of OCD, but also that when we're trying to treat OCD, we're not so much worried about stopping the thought and trying to negate the thought like we do in cognitive behavioral therapy. What we're trying to do is negate the behavior, because the behavior reinforces the thought. And so for me, it was around, you know, thinking of that 3 to 5 hour locking up the house thing example that I mentioned earlier. It's around doing that imperfectly. So instead of going around in a specific order, so the front door might be number 1, the front window might be number 2, and so forth around the house, instead of being, say, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and these 5 things being a different part of the house, it could be doing that in reverse and telling the brain, no, I'm in control. I don't need to do it in that perfect order that you're telling me is perfect.
Right.
Or it could be 1, 2, and then mixing it up. It could be 1, 2, 4, 5, 3. So going around in zigzags around the house instead of a perfect circle or whatever. And then if I'm feeling really good, it could be around skipping one of the numbers. And that's a huge part of it, because like that's really telling OCD that, wow, we can't get this anywhere near perfect if we're going to miss that window.
Right.
And so it was, I've really started to practice that and to externalize my OCD as well. So when I'm standing at that front door and I'm touching it a certain number of times and I'm trying to hear that perfect thud or whatever it is that tells me that it's locked, it's actually saying to myself in the middle of the night, could be at 1 o'clock in the morning, saying, Simon, this is your OCD checking this door. And by externalizing that, getting it out of my brain, I'm like, I can sit with that and go, you know what? It is discomfort. Like, this is a lot of discomfort, or it's uncomfortable, or it's distressing, but I'm not this person. Like, this is just part of my brain trying to trick me to say that this door is not locked. And so that really, I guess, set the scene for what healthy coping is with OCD. It's about recognizing it when it's happening and doing something a little bit differently that doesn't reinforce that obsessive thought. So doing something with your behaviors that doesn't reinforce that obsessive thought. But I didn't discover that until my late 30s. And I was diagnosed in 2012, but we're talking around another maybe 8 years after that, roughly, or even longer, that because it was after COVID. So it was probably 10 years after diagnosis that I started to work on the OCD and try to unpack it and learn about it, understand how it operates in the brain and the body. But to take it back to unhealthy coping mechanisms, around my teenage years, so I was probably around 14, 15 when I started drinking. It was at the end of a football season. The footy team went away, and someone managed to pick up a few cartons of beer, and we all shared it. And something, when I drank the alcohol, I felt relaxed, and I'm like, oh wow, this is a really nice feeling. I don't usually feel like this until after a game, when I've just exerted all my energy, or I've gone to athletics for the day and run a lot and jumped a lot and done all those types of things. And I'm like, I don't need to exercise to the extreme to get this emotional relief and stress relief. And so what also happened is it enabled me to be fun and have fun and stop being so reserved, because I was quite a reserved kid, and be that happy-go-lucky kid, that mum had said before I was 8, that I kind of lost along the way a little bit. And so I did it more and more, and I found ways to do it more. I found parties to go to every other weekend, and then it became every weekend. And for me, it felt like at the time I was just having a lot of fun, and it would just feel good. I didn't link it with my OCD or anxiety or depression at all. It was just a lot of fun, and it coincided with when I was in year 12, American Pie, the movie, came out. And I had this obsession when I saw that movie, and I watched a few other movies, I think like Van Wilder and a few other like similar college style movies, where there's a lot of drinking going on. Everyone looks so happy. It looks like fun. It's nothing I'd ever experienced. So I'm like, I kind of romanticized this notion of being this drunk college jock, persona within my friend groups. And in fact, we actually called each other some of the nicknames from American Pie, the movie. I think I was shitbreak or something because I couldn't take a shit at school. but I was a cross between that and Stifler, because I was also that hyper masculine jock, and so we were living that, and we were having fun with that. And then as I entered into some serious relationships, like I was one of those guys that you get into a relationship with a girl, and that was it. For, you were pretty much married from day one. And when some of those broke down, and then they started up again, and then I found another person, and that broke down as well. It was just this never-ending cycle of happiness, but then stress management, anxiety management, depression that was undiagnosed, and just coping with alcohol. And it just became the norm. So it wasn't every other weekend. It wasn't just on the weekends. It became a regular thing. And I needed to drink a lot. So it wouldn't be just like, I just have 1 or 2 beers just to take the edge off. It would be, I think this came from wanting to have this party guy as well. Yeah. So it always was a carton of beers. So it was 24 beers. And I wouldn't necessarily drink 24, but I would have to have so many beers available that if it turned into a really good night, that there was enough beer. I had this fear of running out of beer. Yeah. And so this continued as a cycle right up until my 40th birthday. And I think it intertwined with OCD a lot more when I became a public servant. So when I finished university and I found a job, it wasn't a job that lit me up. It was just a job that I kind of fell into. But what would happen is I discovered this thing called Friday night drinks after work. I never had that experience before. And so I went to these things, and I would get drunk, and I would feel like I'm having a good time. But then what would happen the next day is I would start ruminating a lot. And I'm like, I'd never experienced this before. Like, I'd ruminate it and ruminate and ruminate. And the idea was that it was my brain trying to replay the night before's events. trying to check that I was safe and secure and that I hadn't done something to offend someone so that they'll come after me. Like it could be a manager or something, or someone in the workplace. Did I say something that was going to get me fired? All these types of things would run through my brain at a million miles an hour. And I would think about these things to the extent that the night's memories would become distorted and I would forget what actually did happen. Yeah. And I would have this distorted nightmare going around in my head for like a week afterwards. But then I wouldn't kind of tap into that and go, oh, what's going on here? I would just keep doing it, trying to escape these thoughts all the time. And this continued right up until, I was 40. Well, yeah, pretty much right until I was 40. But I think the catalyst for getting the diagnosis and starting the treatment process was my wife was recognizing this, or my now wife was recognizing this leading up to my 28th birthday. So 2 years before that, she's like, Simon, you're doing this thing with this drinking. You're drinking way too much. But when you do this thinking process and it just gets out of control. You can't get out of bed. You're so moody and grumpy and so forth. You need to get help. For 2 years, I batted that away. I said, no, I did like what most guys do. If the problem is not so much me, maybe it's you. You need to go talk to someone. And I ignored that. But then eventually I thought, you know what, she's right. I do need to speak to someone about this. And so that's what prompted the diagnosis. But I never changed the drinking. And I kept doing it because it felt safe. And now I had the meds. So I had medication and alcohol, which was the medication for me was doing the work during the day and the alcohol was doing the work at nighttime.
Yeah, just basically cut down on your cost for alcohol.
Yeah, well, basically. And so I did that and I drank and I didn't change that behavior. And therapists would tell me, Simon, you need to change the behavior. You need to change the alcohol, stop the alcohol. And because it's apparently it impacts the way your meds work as well. I'm like, whatever, like I'm feeling okay, like I'm feeling great. Exactly. And so I never changed, but not until I turned 40. And what prompted that change is by then I had committed to a new degree, new career pathway. So I'd been studying social work at a master's level. I wanted to become a men's therapist because I now knew what mental health was, and I knew my own personal struggle. But then we had COVID happened, and alcohol just ramped up there as well. And one of the key factors that stopped me drinking was my kids, actually. So I've got an 8-year-old, no, a 7-year-old. I keep saying he's 8, but he's 7. And I think I'm saying this at the moment because I'm always thinking about when I was 8, and it's scaring me a little bit, actually. And so he's 7, and I've got a daughter who's 4. And since COVID, like my kids would gradually say more and more things related to me and alcohol. So it would be like, oh, Daddy, it's the weekend. Are you having a beer? Or my son and say, Daddy, can I have a sip of your beer? And I'm like, no way in hell that you're having a sip of beer. Like I see other dads in Australia, like other dads would go, yeah, it's all right. He can have a beer, a little sip of beer. It's fun. I mean, I think I vaguely remember me having a sip of my dad's beer or my mum's shandy back in the
oh yeah, we all did.
90s.
I feel like
yeah. And I'm like, it was gross, but but I'm like, no way in hell, because internally I was saying that because I knew the pain that I'd been living in for so long, and I didn't want them to get the taste for it. And so that was something that I definitely said no to, but I didn't like them talking about me and alcohol in the same sentence. And I didn't like them talking about alcohol at all, really. And we'd go to, we'd get in the car and we'd go to dinner or we'd go to a party, and every time it would be that my wife was a designated driver because I was the designated drinker. Because I'd be like, I can't go and socialize without drinking. So if I'm not drinking, I'm not going. So it'd always be me in the passenger seat, and my kids would always get confused by that because Dad always drives. They're like, why is Dad not driving today? We want Dad to drive. And we'd have to say, oh, Dad's been drinking, so you're not allowed to drink and drive. And as we're saying these words, my gut was just sinking and sinking. And like, I hate having these conversations with my 2 little kids. Like it's conditioning them to think that alcohol is something that's really fantastic. And for a long time, I felt like it was fantastic, but I was getting all these little light bulb moments in my head saying, it isn't fantastic, and I hate this. And in fact, it even got to a point where I was drinking and I'm like, I'm not enjoying this anymore, but I'm just doing it because I need stress relief. I need to slow that anxious brain down. I need to feel alive in some senses. And then my 40th happened, and I thought I was going to get all these wonderful, presents. It's your 40th. This is fantastic. The presents that I did get were all alcohol. And it was all craft beer. It was, because I was loving craft beer at the time, or it was alcohol paraphernalia. And I'm just like, this sucks. Like, this is shit. And at the end of the night, I'd had way too many drinks, and I broke down to my wife, and I cried, and I said, what is this? Why am I getting all this alcohol? And she said, Simon, that's because that's your identity. That's what people know you for. And I'm like, I don't want that identity. Like, I want one that's healthy and happy and doesn't need alcohol. I'm sick of this. I'm tired of it. And so that night we committed, because me and my wife came to that decision together that I need to get rid of alcohol. And so the next day we took all the alcohol out the fridge and we gave it away, and haven't looked back since. So we're recording this, March 2024. So it was August 2023 that I gave up alcohol, and I've actually been feeling really good about it, and I haven't felt the urge. And I worried for so many years about giving up alcohol, because I worried about not being able to cope and always having to go back and feeling like a failure if I went back to drinking. I worried about what other people would say, like, particularly guy culture in Australia. It's not guy culture, it's culture in Australia. It's one of those things where if you're not drinking, people ask what's wrong, what's going on. It's a very much of a taboo topic here. And for a long time, I felt shame with my drinking. And then to be, as a podcaster myself and a therapist, like I'd be listening to other people's stories about alcohol and addiction, and I'm like, oh, that's a really cool story. I resonate so much with that. But also part of me said, that's not me. I'm not that addict or whatever. And I don't see myself as an addict. In fact, I did a really cool episode with Sarah Rusbatch here. She's a grey area drinking coach. So when we think of addiction, and alcohol addiction particularly, we think of the stereotype of the guy that's lost it all. He's sleeping on a park bench. He's got the brown paper bag that he's taking swigs out of. That wasn't me. I was the opposite. I was a high performer. That perfectionism made me, I've got 2 university degrees. I started a business. I have a family. I have a house. I have everything that most people would look like, want in their lives. But I also drank to normalize the brain, or to numb the brain. And I wasn't that park bench guy at all. I didn't see myself as an addict. So, but what Sarah was talking about is that we have this spectrum of drinking. So some people, they don't drink, and then other people can have 1 or 2 and that satisfies their thirst. And then you have this very big grey area between, say, 2 and 9, where we either can kind of get to 5 or 6 and give up, or we just lose the nights and we don't know how to give up. And then you've got number 10, which is that guy that's lost everything, and because of alcohol, and he's relying on it every single day. And see, I wouldn't wake up and need alcohol. Like, I wasn't drinking in the mornings. I'd have all these rules around when I drank and what I would do, and so forth. And so it wasn't something that I needed to have to get through every day, but it was becoming something that I was needing to every other day to just manage and cope with anxiety and stress. And so that's the unhealthy aspect of my drinking. And there's a lot of shame, and I felt a lot of shame about talking about it. And I think that's what stopped me from giving up for so long, is this shame, because I'd also been that guy at the pub who questioned other people for their not drinking.
Right.
And I felt shame and guilt for saying those types of things as well. So yeah, the yin and the yang, the healthy managing distress, but also the unhealthy coping with alcohol.
When it's interesting, as you were talking, I think that when you said that the OCD was never addressed, obviously hindsight is different because I didn't know you at that time, but I'm thinking, how would you not address that? Because it's clear that the OCD is what basically led to the drinking, ultimately led to the depression, because you're in this constant hypervigilant state all the time, that the burnout and the depression was your body basically just trying to balance when you're up here all the time. And so you can see it, but again, hindsight, people are seeing what they see. And you were, like you said, you wore masks. And so you might be more willing to talk about the depression or other aspects of the anxiety, but the OCD was precious because it felt like it was the thing that protected you. And if you followed these rules and did these things, then you would be okay. And so The interesting thing that you said was that when you were drinking, basically you got the best of both worlds, because now your OCD and that perfectionist piece is feeding into, whether it is the masculinity aspect, the whatever the role is, and being the best at that role. And then the drinking gave you back that feeling you had when you were 8 and your mom was telling you these things. And so you could have both. And so now you're like, well, this is everything. So you had it. But then what's happening is, because it's all based on these scarcity driven ideas. If I could lose it, I've got to keep up with it. It's a performance. That's where the shell comes in, is, well, if I don't have this, if I don't do these things, I alone am not enough. I alone am not funny enough or silly enough to have at the parties. And the part that I think is probably, and I'm sure for you, you've gone back and thought about it too, is the key distinction of where you were still looking for some depth of emotional connection and security is when you described your relationships, where it was like, you're not that character you're trying to portray, because you didn't see women as a tool to use and throw out, or people as a tool to use and throw out. You wanted depth and connection and security. You were wanting to make sure that somebody wouldn't leave, and your brain and your body was longing for that. And so it's such an interesting thing when you go back and you look at it, how we know that we need connection and belonging to be okay. That is a basic human need. You had a pervasive threat that your connection and belonging in the world was always at risk, and how your body has actively worked to try to secure your position, either through that OCD lens and or through the drinking. And so giving it up, it became your identity. And I also think, that piece around, well, 2 more things that you said. One, I'm sure you know this, and being mindful that your OCD brain is going to try to get fixated on your son when he turns 8. It is going to try to get you stuck there. So being super mindful of that, because what we do is we reduce our story to, no, I just have to stop him from ever having alcohol with this. Alcohol was never your problem. That was never what you needed. That was never what you were missing. Alcohol was you trying to regulate something that was dysregulated in your body. So not letting your OCD get fixated on something that isn't there. But then that second part of thinking about when we get stuck there, the comparison piece of, I did it in my eating disorder too. I'm not that bad. I'm not like that skinny. I'm not eating that few of calories a day. I'm not throwing up that many times. So you start to rationalize it. We use the comparison in our favor. We use it both to keep us down. I'm not as good as this person, and I'm not as bad as this person. So it lets us stay stuck in our cycle of predictable shittiness. The reason you stopped is you found something bigger than you, because you're right. You weren't the guy on the park bench. You also weren't really living. You were just sort of existing. And on paper, it sounds like you got an A, but paper isn't your kids in the car asking why you're not driving. That's the heart. And that was when you said, oh, this is something bigger than me. And I don't want to be that person. I don't want to leave other people feeling like I can't show up for them the way that I've been longing for someone to show up for me. And you let that go. So there's, yes, absolutely more work to do. There always will be. And I think it's that piece. And I'm curious, because I know that we're getting close to the end. Like I said it in the beginning. We've got 17 episodes we're packing into this, which is why everyone's going to have to come check out your podcast, go to your website, just connect with you to keep going. What do you wish people would know? Like if we go back to you at 8, or we go back to you at 15 or 16 when you found the alcohol, or we go back to you at that moment that you said, okay, alcohol is a thing, but I'm not giving it up. What is something that you wish you could have heard or been said to you, or what do you wish other people knew that might allow them to just hold a brief moment of pause before that scarcity mindset takes back over again?
Big question, because there's so many things come to mind, and I think I come back to a moment in the schoolyard, which is not too long after I was 8 years old, and I saw a friend of mine. He was crying in the schoolyard. My best mate, he was crying, and I walked up to him and said, I didn't even ask him what was wrong. I just said, mate, you got to stop crying. You got to stop crying. I kept saying this to him. He's like, why? Like, I don't need to stop crying. I'm allowed to cry if I want to. And I wish someone had said that to me and that I believed it as well, because I was doing that thing that I'd been conditioned, or I was conditioning myself to do, is not show emotions. And I felt like if other people saw him crying, that they would think less of him. I just wish I had that reversed to me. And so that's a common theme that I have with the guys that I work with in my therapy clinic now as well, is they're all coming to me with these stories of bottling it up for so long and wishing that they were encouraged to express themselves earlier or had someone that they could talk to earlier. A lot of the referrals I get is for someone who they're looking for positive male role models. So I wish they had that and knew where to find those things. Yes, I had my dad and 3 brothers, but I wouldn't necessarily say that they were positive role models. Like that's all I knew. Like I was born into this family, right. But it wasn't like we're sitting around and having these deep and meaningfuls about emotional intelligence or anything like that. Or if I was upset and I went to Dad, he would just say, stop crying.
Right.
And
because he didn't know any better either.
That's right.
Because I'm sure no one ever told him that.
It's intergenerational. And that's why, I'm seeing guys who are my dad's age coming into the clinic for the first time and sharing stories and so forth. So I think, it goes back to that other moment with my mate. And if someone said to me, like, it's not weak to speak, we have this, I use this for men's mental health. It's not weak to speak. It's actually really positive and it's a strength-based process to speak up your mind and share it, because we know in the men's mental health space that if we don't, the results are often things like addiction or family and domestic violence. Males are overrepresented in perpetrators of family and domestic violence. Same goes for suicide as well. And so, imprisonment, all these things, these are unhealthy ways, I think, because guys have lost or haven't been taught, should I say, the ability to healthily express themselves. And it comes out in very dangerous and aggressive ways. And so for me, it was all internalized. That aggression was internalized. It was me beating myself up for years and years and years. So having someone early on say that, Simon, it's okay, you can share this stuff, would maybe have changed my life. Maybe it wouldn't have resulted in all the things. But at the same time, I wouldn't be here today if it didn't happen and sharing the story. So that I'm hopeful that by sharing my story, that someone else out there might recognize a bit of OCD or a bit of depression or a bit of anxiety or a bit of alcohol misuse or be able to relate that to something in their lives, and go, you know what, maybe it's time for me to start sharing and going to see someone. And that can look different for different people. It could be your mate or it could be your partner. It could be going to see your doctor. That's a great place to start because they're unbiased as well and sharing what's going on. And I wished I did that when I was 8, but I didn't. And I didn't know how to, and it is what it is. But just that recognition that it's okay to be not okay and it's not weak to speak. And I'm starting to ramble off all these little affirmations that I tell myself all the time and I tell other people, but it's so true. Like, we can get out of our heads and it's not a life sentence as well. We can actually go to thrive. And you mentioned before that I was just surviving. I was just existing for a long time. And I think burnout, and I always thank burnout for this, it enabled me to take off the mask and start to thrive again and start to be that happy-go-lucky kid and be silly with the kids and not be perfect and embrace that. And so this is actually a really positive thing. And I'm just grateful for you inviting me on to start talking about it for so many people. Hearing other people share their stories can be inspiring and prompt change. So I'm grateful to be here and prompting change for hopefully somebody out there.
Well, and I think the cool part is that you are still aware that your journey is one that you have to actively show up and work on. And, for all of us to kind of think about, particularly, when we talk about the patriarchy and toxic masculinity, I think oftentimes the story gets painted as men are the villains. There's problems in every system that has created themes that has allowed for things to happen. But when we create that, I think there's also some unintentional perpetual suffering that is created for men in those positions of still feeling like it is their job to handle everything and do it all and take care of everyone around them. And women experience it in different ways. We're not saying that is specific to one culture, one group, one identity. But I do think it's important to remember that we can talk about privilege and we can talk about systems of oppression. That's important. We also have to talk about the oppression that exists within that system of basically creating an entire unit of people that's like, your job is to take care of it all. And your feelings are not valid unless they are anger and aggression by way of these toxic movies and expression and whatever it is that we're seeing. And so that lack of a space, because we're so busy saying, but because you get this power here, basically this doesn't matter, I think often perpetuates that silence, because now it's, well, if I'm a white male, or let's say I'm a male with a higher socioeconomic status, or I'm a male with whatever, I should be okay, because look at, this is the picture that's painted, and realizing that mental health is something we all struggle with. And that particularly, it sounds like for you, you want men that have been raised with those stories that their emotions are something they have to fix or do away with, that they are allowed to bring them to the table, and that allows them to be a full person and to create a different story of how to work through that. So you can teach your 7, almost 8-year-old son what it looks like when he has that moment where someone says something to him where he feels like he has to hide himself, where he doesn't do that. And he can come home to you and he can cry to you. And that's your corrective experience. Maybe you didn't do it to your friend, but you will do it when your son comes home and he's crying, and you will hold him and you will say, you can cry. Let's talk through this. That's the corrective part. That is the healing. And I think that's the gift you're creating ripples for, if people are ready to receive it, through your podcast and through your work as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And you were saying, like, all the things you were saying about, I've got the privilege, I'm white, I'm male, you know, in my social work degree, the career that I chose to go through, it tells me that I am the oppressor and I am the one who is doing all the damage, and I have all the privilege, but then internally I'm the opposite. I am the one who's broken, or has been broken. I'm no longer broken. Like I've been put back together in an imperfect way, and that's okay. Like, you know, we're never going to be put back together perfectly, and I don't want to be perfect as well. So it's interesting you brought up that. But yeah, I certainly do look at my son and think, I want to be there for you. I want to be that best dad that I can be, that best positive male role model that I never had, you know, and nurture him through it. And part of the thing that scares me is my wife would often say that we are two splitting images of each other. We have the same personality and so forth. So I'm doing this with a lot of intention and purpose, trying to not have, I guess it's up to him to grow into the person that he's going to grow into. But if I can guide him away from some of these, you know, life decisions that I went through, with, you know, showing him. And so I cry in front of him, and he'll come up to me and say, Daddy, what's wrong? And I'll let him know to a degree what's wrong. I don't want to overburden him, but I want him to see that Dad can get upset as well. And the same in my therapy clinic. I'm a lived experience therapist. So when guys in my therapy clinic say, Simon, have you experienced depression or alcohol misuse or whatever? I say, yeah, like I have. And these are some of the things I use to come out of that. Can they be applied to your story? Or for every now and then I get someone with OCD and we have the most amazing conversations because we get each other. And that's very rare in this space as well. Like nobody treated the OCD because I don't think people really understand it. It's not a sexy condition to work with, but when you look into it, it is actually really complicated. It is unique. It is different for every person as well. For anyone listening, I don't have a clean and tidy house. I'm not into that neat freak stuff that a lot of people associate OCD with. I've got 2 kids, and so it looks like a tornado's going through the house. And so my themes are all different, and we can get into that another episode around different themes of OCD if you want to. But yeah, again, thanks for letting me come on and share, because sharing is caring, I find, and there's power in sharing our stories and helping other people to have their own light bulb moments too. I
love this. And now I get to hold you to that you want to come do a second episode. So we will have to do one that's more on OCD. And I think the last thing I'll say, and then I'll let you go, is when you said that about your son and there's that concern that you're like a spitting image of each other, the really cool part about that is you also know that what you needed wasn't for someone to be perfect for you or to stop you from doing things that maybe weren't the quote unquote right choice. You needed somebody to ask enough questions to understand why you did it in the first place and be with you while you were doing it. That you're going to give him no questions asked. So I think your OCD is going to want to make it that it's your job to protect him. It is your job to love him and to give him the space to figure out who he is without feeling like he has to hide it. You're already doing that. So I think if you can take the pressure off a little bit, maybe that's one area that we can tell your anxious brain to just like settle for a minute. It's got enough things that it's worrying about right now, like resort Wi-Fi reliability and all sorts of other things. So let's just put that one on the back for a while.
That's a great way to reframe it. Absolutely. And I'm going to hold you to that. That's what I'm going to walk out of this room with.
Perfect.
That mantra. So.
I love it. Okay. Well, everybody, I'm so excited because we'll bring Simon on again. We'll talk about OCD. We'll dive more into this. Make sure that you leave us some comments. Tell us in the Q&A and the poll what you want us to talk about with OCD, or if there's more on this topic that we didn't talk about, you want us to make sure we cover next time. I will have links so that you can connect with Simon all in the show notes. So please make sure you do that. The way that he talks and he shares, it really is just... it's that experiential and that connection place. And it's so powerful. And I've loved every minute of getting to connect with you here, but also just watching what you do. So for everyone else, give yourself a minute. Once you turn this podcast off, always just kind of take a breath, let it sink in, take one thing with you, and then let the rest just kind of wash through you. Come back to it when you're ready, and we'll see you next Sunday.